all, what on earth are all of you doing here? I was like expecting a small crowd. I would have been so happy with a small crowd. And now I'm like, oh my God. So for context, this is my first all JavaScript conference. And I'm like, I was told, don't say use the platform because people have opinions on frameworks. And I'm like, OK, we'll see where it goes. So hi, everyone. My name is Nitya Narasimhan. Oh my God, there are more people. My name is Nitya Narasimhan. And today, I want to talk to you about web components. But I want to set the stage first. How many of you attended the keynote? Yay. How many of you have used web components or worked with web components in any way? Oh, good. How many of you know Polymer? OK, you don't count. How many of you want, like, deep dive code at 3 o'clock in the afternoon after a full day of talks? Because this is when your cognitive bandwidth is the highest. So I want to say two things to set the stage. One, I am a technology enthusiast. I came to this because I was like, this is cool, and I want to talk about it. So anyone else who's like, well, this is not the right time, my goal today is to say, hey, if you're working the web space, this is a good time for us to be looking at web components. Don't know what you want to do with them, but look at them and see how they fit into your tool belt, because the time is coming when it's going to be a great skill to have. But before I set the stage for a little bit about me, I'm not your regular developer, just so you know. I've been in this industry for over 2 decades. I know I look very young, but it's deceptive. But I actually started out in research. I have a PhD in computer engineering, and I worked in Motorola for over a decade on their next generation set-top box and mobile platforms, building middleware services and applications there. And the one thing that taught me, how many of you have Motorola phones? How many of you they say Lenovo now, right? The one thing it taught me is nothing in life is certain, right? So you constantly have to look at technology with the perspective of how do I adapt and use what's there. But more recently, over the past few years, I've actually focused a lot more on development and advocacy. So I live in the upstate New York. For those of you from New York City, it means north of the park, apparently. But I live in the Albany area. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is getting that community there to kind of like retrain and use some of these technologies. So I work with local universities, I work with local startups, I work with small businesses. And one of my biggest things is to kind of like get people to be aware of technology, but then think about how they translate it into something impactful, whether it's through building features, whether it's through migrating legacy software, whatever. And the one thing I'm proud of is I also run a community. I run the Google Developer Group in New York City. Anybody know it? Yes, my people. All right. And it was actually through GDG New York City that I first came across Polymer. Now, in one of the earlier sessions this morning, someone asked, how long has it been around? This is proof. I ran this event in 2014. And in 2014, we ran something called the Polymer Polytechnic. It was the first time that web components had shown up as a twinkle in the eye of some standards writer somewhere. And Google was releasing one of its earliest releases of Polymer. And so we ran this thing, right? And this is basically the why not of my title. We ran this event where we told people web components are cool. You need to look into it, and here's Polymer. That's going to help you. And I'll be honest, I came into the web development space from mobile and distributed systems, sane frameworks and languages. And then I saw JavaScript. I mean, like, seriously, heartburn, right? So when I looked at Polymer, to me, OK, I know I shouldn't say it, but whatever. When I looked at Polymer, what I really liked about it was two things, right? And web components in general, that I could read the code and understand what it was doing, and that it let me bring a lot of my ideas around object-oriented and encapsulation into this domain. And that's kind of why I kind of loved it, right? But I would go to people and say, can I build something for you? And be like, no, because it's really not on all the platforms. And so I was like, OK, I'll park it. I'll look at it later. But I kept an eye on it. And I kept seeing that people were building things with it in industry. So fast forward to 2018, and it was actually 2017 at Google I/O and Chrome summits. And we kind of started seeing this map show up. So don't worry about slides. I'll put the links out later. But if you go to webcomponents.org, they track what is the standards adoption across browser vendors today. And yeah, we're still not completely there. But the big thing here is that you can see there's a lot of greens and 3 columns saying stable. So in some sense, it was giving me a little bit more kind of satisfaction that it's going into the native platform. And of course, there are such unusual standouts. IE is usually so ahead of the game. So it was surprising they weren't on board yet. But Firefox is getting there. And so it's still good, because even if they're not supporting it natively, we have polyfills. So I thought to myself, this is the time for us to try to do something back in the space. And in I jumped. So over the next 40 minutes, what I hope to cover is actually two things. At a very high level, I want to talk to you about what web components are. And I'm so brilliant, I forgot to start my timer, so we're going to have 10 minutes more of my talk than you thought. What web components are. And second is, OK, if you are starting in this space, how would you go about using and building your first web component? And so to a large extent, this is my audience, right? People who haven't used it before who want to play with the space, not people who have like production stuff to ship in 3 weeks, just so you know. What I hope your journey will be. Yeah, I know we're not supposed to put memes, but these are lovely. Come on. So on the right side, if you are, part of your journey today is going to feel like that. There's a lot of information coming off your way. But the win will be if you're on the right. If there's one moment during this talk when you hear something and you're like, OK, that looks interesting. Now I want to go look at it. Then I've won. OK? So you're all bosses now, and I'll win if you like one thing about what I say today. Fair enough? OK. So why are we all here today? At the end of the day, we all go to conferences, including this one, because building modern web apps can be complicated, like the relationship status on Facebook. You don't know exactly where you stand, right? And there's always things changing. And I wanted to start off by first setting the stage against two things. When we think about developing for the web, we want to look at developer experience, and then we want to look at user experience. And I want to talk about developer experience in a minute, but developer experience is really about understanding, we're developers, how do I make my life easy? Forget the user, right? Not really. But user experience is about how people are using web apps, right? How do we make their experience better? So I want to start with the right side. When we talk about user experience, what do we mean? First, we want, like, if you think of yourself as a user, the statistic is that increasingly people are accessing web apps on their mobile phones. We all know this, right? And that means that they are now biased towards seeing experiences that are similar to native. That's what they want. That's what their expectation is. So they expect fast performance, right? So it means like smooth scrolling, 60 frames a second. They expect the minute they click a link, it should load instantly. And these are challenges for a web developer to deliver on. Second, they expect engaging experiences. And this means not only like the full screen version of things where it doesn't look like it's in a browser, but also tiny little things like, you expect to be alerted when someone tells you something and you're not actually looking at your screen. But web apps are not going to do that for you, right? So how do I get those kind of features in? And third, and most important of all, let me remind you, I live in upstate New York. The reason I say this is you cannot call me on my cell phone for 3/4 of the day. If you think offline is about developing nations, you'd be dead wrong. I live in an offline world for 3/4 of the day. Most of my work gets done on Wi-Fi. It's not a joke. Try calling me sometime. Actually, don't. But the point is that reliable is really important because we want apps that are going to work wherever they are. We are like trying to make sure that the user, when he needs it, can see it, right? So that's where it is. How many of you have heard of progressive web apps? Oh, yay, you're my people. OK. So then I don't have to go into this. But really, when I was thinking about user experience, the things that we're looking at, the technologies and the goals we look at is in this domain, right? And I have to put my Google hat on because I run a Google developer group, and pretty much everything I learned came through that. So I am a little biased, yeah, sure. But really, when I think about it, I'm like, there are tools to help us there. It doesn't matter what your front-end framework is. It doesn't matter what your choices are. These should work for you anyway. So from a fast perspective, you can use something like Project Lighthouse, run an audit, understand where your app has got issues. But more importantly, it doesn't just tell you, it doesn't just like blame game you. It actually helps you fix them. And that itself is a learning process that I have found useful. Second, for the engaging, right, we want to be able to do things like deliver push notifications. And it turns out that with things like HTTP2, and you can do this. You can get push on with web apps, right, which is cool. OK, there are tools for this. Finally, service workers. We all love service workers, right? Come on. Work with me here. Thank you. But that is, at least that is the goal. That is the end goal. This is where we're headed towards, right? So if you want reliable things, service workers is a background thread that's going to cache content, make sure it intelligently mediates between requests coming in that go either to the backend or to a cache, and make sure that no matter where you are and what your network is, you see something, right? And so this is the user experience. Am I going too slow? All right. So now we're going to talk about the developer experience, right? And this is where the web component story for me begins. So as a developer experience, 3 things matter to me. Now, I'll go back and tell you, I'm an independent developer. We work on low budgets. We work on very little time. And often customers change their opinion like every 5 minutes. So we've learned to be really, really pragmatic, right? It's like, whatever you tell me, I'm going to fix it and hack it and make it work. And so to me, these three things matter. First, reusability. Whatever I build, as much as possible, I want to be able to reuse over and over again. I've got a little piece of code that does auth. Hey, maybe I can kind of put it in a corner and reuse it everywhere I need to go. It would be nice if it could be standardized, right? That's in the back of my mind. Second, maintainability. Now, maintainability means different things to different people. But to me, what it means is, if somebody else wrote code that I have to deal with, I need to understand it. I need to know how to work with it. And second, I need tools and I need a workflow that lets me go from just creating something to actually deploying it. So maintainability to me is about an ecosystem of tooling. And finally, interoperability. Because we all know that, hey, even now there's COBOL out there somewhere. And what I mean by that is that your code never dies. Wherever you go, whatever project you work with, you have to work with legacy code. So when I think about any new technology that I want to try out, I really want to understand, hey, how is it going to work with the other things in my ecosystem that I have to make it work with, right? So these are my goals. And this is how kind of what I want to talk about today maps onto them. It's not a perfect mapping, but if you keep this in the back of your mind, it would help. So when I talk about reusability, that's where we're going to talk about web components, what they are and how they provide reusable building blocks for web app development. When I talk about maintainability, I'm really looking at, is there an ecosystem of tooling that lets me get from thinking and learning something to building and deploying it fast? That's why we're going to talk about the Polymer project. And finally, interoperability. Great, all this is awesome, but where's the proof that it's going to work with the things I want it to work with? And that's a site that's maintained by the Google team, customelements.everywhere.com, where you can go and see how easily can custom elements be used with existing frameworks. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So 6 minutes in, and now I'm going to tell you what web components are. So how many of you already know what web components are? Oh, OK, you're going to hear me anyway. So web components at a very high level are a set of platform APIs. And when we talk about the platform here, we're actually talking about the browser. Platform API is to create custom, reusable, and encapsulated tags for use in web pages and web apps that work across modern browsers, can be used with any JavaScript framework, right? That's a lot to cover. And it's like, hey, and I'll tell you the Brooklyn Bridge while I'm at it. But if you break it down, what is this actually doing? So let's look into it. First, the platform APIs. So I'm actually going to slow down here for just a minute, because if there's, yes, I can do that. It is possible. Those like shocked looks from this side. I'm like, because platform APIs, if there's one thing, if you walk out of this tomorrow, if you walk out of this and someone says, OK, what was web components about? Just tell them these 4 APIs. It's like, hey, there are 4 APIs. And it's like, OK, good, you knew something. But these are the 4 APIs that make up the web component standard: custom elements, shadow DOM, HTML imports, and HTML templates. And the thing that you want to keep in mind is that these are standards and these are APIs, but that doesn't mean they're set in stone. So even in this right now, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, a couple of them are already being kind of like moved away towards something else. But for now, we're going to start with a blank sheet, right? We're like, what are these? Custom elements. How many of you love your divs? Oh my God, what are you doing in this? OK. So my example, which I always give people, which resonates with me a lot because I have a 9-year-old who loves NFL, is assume that you have to write a page that kind of put out a schedule for the NFL teams, right? That's a lot of stuff. There are teams and schedules and players and scores, tons and tons of divs and tons of IDs and tons of classes, right? And we all love our global namespace in JavaScript and in the web, where you can clobber everyone's stuff willy-nilly, right? So what can we do if we want to actually make this into something where I can say, hey, Chicago Bears, you get to have this space, you define what it looks like, and I'll use it. Wouldn't it be nice if I would have just a tag that says Chicago-Bears, I use that in my web browser, and bingo, that puts up the card which says when their next game is, what their current standing is, and yay, go for whatever it is, whoever's their quarterback, they keep changing, I don't know. That's what custom elements is for. With custom elements, you can design and use new types of DOM elements. It gives you the ability to do named elements, right? But if you think about it, one of the most useful things for me in working in the space, and I kind of just started playing with it, was the fact that you start understanding how the DOM works because of all the work you go through trying to make the equivalent of your own element, right? So in custom elements, if you want to make this work, first of all, there's just a name tag, and you put it in there, you expect certain behaviors. Now, suppose now let's go back to my Chicago Bears example. I wanted to, when I put Chicago Bears, it should have the Chicago Bears colors. But when I put the Chicago Bears element in a page that's owned by the Pittsburgh Steelers because they're going and playing them, Steelers are going to try to mess with my CSS. We don't want that to happen. We want all of them to look branded the way they are, right? So I want a way to be able to encapsulate style. I want a way to kind of have my element control its own behavior. That's where Shadow DOM comes in. If you understand one thing about Shadow DOM, think of it like here is your DOM, your main DOM. You've created a custom element magically. A Shadow DOM is like a subtree that's hidden behind this that effectively can be seen by the main tree and that allows you to do what you would do in a DOM, which is like show, store state, put in behaviors, etc., without being impacted by this. And there are ways for you to pierce this, like you can have interactions between the two. So at a very high level, that's what the Shadow DOM does. Now, all right, so somehow you've built your element and you've described all of the stuff and you've got encapsulated state. Brilliant. How do you actually go about using it? So if you're familiar with web apps, right? Okay, that was a bad joke. Okay. You want to be able to import that into your app and actually build the whole thing with those components composed together. How do you do that? That's where HTML imports comes in. It was initially an API that was used to tell you how you could package up the definition that you had in an HTML file and bring it into your web apps source so that you could build it and kind of use it in your HTML to kind of use those elements, right? The problem is the world was moving. ES6 came along, and that's what we use for packaging these days, and it's really much, much more standard. So later on, we'll talk about how this API is moving away, but for now, we're going to stick with this. Imports is for you to bring elements in. And finally, templating. Remember I was telling you about you have a Shadow DOM that's sitting behind your element? Now, you want to have a custom look and feel for this custom element that you have. So you want to come up with your own markup. HTML templates lets you craft this markup with a nice little twist, which is that markup is inert. When you pull it in, when you download it, nothing happens. It's not actually going off crazy and fetching all the images and whatever else it's supposed to be doing. Nothing happens until you stamp it out and use it in an element. And so it kind of becomes a really nice way to ship around little snippets of code that you can actually use to define your element. So far, so good? We can all go home now? OK. You still got a few more minutes of me. So my one kind of request to you is, yeah, all these APIs are not perfect. But if you had to start one way, remember my little sloth who was like aha moment? If there's one place where you'll find your aha moment, it'll probably be in the custom elements. Surely, surely, surely you want custom tags, right? So if there's one place that you kind of want to explore, start here. The custom element API is the core of your web components model. So how do I go about defining it? Now, for the next few slides, we're going to just go through a little bit of code examples. But these are with the spec. They're nothing to do with any implementation. These are how they're defined in the spec. So first one, how do you define a custom element? It actually has two parts to it. Defining it is as simple as like having an ES6 class that extends HTML element. And bingo, that new class that you've defined is defining a custom element, right? Whatever you're going to put in there, we'll look at that in a minute. But now you've got this class, you need to be able to use it. How do you actually tell the browser, hey, there is a new element, and by the way, the element that I want to have this behavior associated with is called this. That's done by registering it. So the two parts to creating an element are, first you write your class, extend HTML element, and then you register that class along with the tag name that you want to use in your browser. And at this point, you're now ready to start using that element. Now, how do you go about actually using that element? So in your HTML page, which is where you're going to be using these tags, you want to import this definition. So if you use the HTML imports API, that's what it would look like. Your element would be shipped as an HTML file which has all the code for both the templates and everything in it. You're going to import it. There's a build process that actually helps pull that in and stamp it out in yours. Then in your usage itself, all you're going to say is NFL team, and now you've got everything working, right? It knows where to find the definitions, pull it in. It can pull out the subtree, integrate it, flatten it, create it, and now you're back to having a rendered DOM. So far, this is how the standards were doing. But this is what I really kind of like about it. Once you have this tag defined, in every way, shape, and form, it's just like any other HTML tag. So you can do anything you would do with any other HTML tag. Now, this is powerful, right? So theoretically, it's beautiful. We don't know how much of this actually is going to work in practice across everything because there are headaches. But you can do things like you can actually create instances of it with JavaScript. You can attach listeners to it. You can style it, do whatever you like. Once you've actually got this element, so at this point we have an element defined, and we've registered it, you're ready to use it, and you can use it. But so far, it doesn't have any encapsulation, right? And it's at this point that you start deciding whether you want to have a shadow DOM. And with shadow DOM, the way you do this is you basically attach what's called a shadow root. And I'm not going to switch browsers because if we can, we'll do that at the end. But if you go to any page that's using web components and actually inspect it, you will find there's an element called a shadow root. And the shadow root is effectively the root of a subtree. It's kind of like a small sub-DOM that's hidden behind the main DOM that encapsulates the state and the markup, the templates that are in your custom element, right? So when you do this, when you attach a shadow, you can actually say, hey, now I'm having a shadow DOM that shadows my element, and I can actually attach other elements to it, and I can attach styles to it, and so on. And between these two, there is a communication channel. So the shadow DOM can use a host identifier to actually grab hold of the host DOM, and the host basically references by shadow root. So at this point, let's say you've got yourself an element, you've built it, you've got some state, you've done everything. Rule number one for any developer is, reuse before build. Should you rush off and go and build elements for every single thing you have? Probably not. One of the most useful things, and I say this from the perspective of someone who does a lot of rapid prototyping, there's usually an element for that, for at least like your initial exploration. And the place you want to go to is webcomponents.org. And you have standard elements that you can find in collections. And collections are usually things that mimic a bunch of elements that make sense in a certain context. So there's like, for instance, Google has a material, like a paper elements collection. That's all the material components, right? So you can use it for views. There's I think it's called Gold Elements. That was for like e-commerce. There are also third parties like Vaadin that they've put out their own versions of components that you can use for views and so on. So when you want to use a new component, like if you don't want to build your own, search a collection. You can actually see you can preview the usage right in the browser. And then at that point, you can use HTML imports, import it, build your app, try to check it out. You can also publish your own element if you like, and you can publish collections of elements if you've built a bunch of things together. So in my NFL example, if I wanted to, I could actually build an element for every team and ship it out as an NFL collection. And so all of this so far comes to a screeching halt when we recognize that this is great for prototyping, but in the real world, we're not quite ready. So the two things that you'll do at this point, if you're basically getting started in web components, is to track two pages. The first one is this page where you're going to track ecosystem readiness. The day everything in here goes green is the day we'll be like, OK, now we're ready to like say production worthy. But until then, track it. And I'm really surprised that a lot of a lot of the vendors have actually gone to stable state in many of them. I don't know all the versions for it, but I do know that I think Microsoft is, it's here. Microsoft's considering it, and Firefox is working on it. But the other side of this is actually the interoperability. So when I build a custom element, how is it going to work with my existing app if I've built it in React or Vue or whatever? So this is the other side that's worth tracking. And here, what you're really looking at is, what are the issues if I'm going to try to access my custom element from one of these frameworks or vice versa? So these are just some of the examples. And you'll see right now, Angular and Vue are at 100%, and even Polymer is at 91, which is very interesting. But the reason is that they'll put down issues that are related to why they think it's not yet at 100% interoperability. The main thing I want to say about this site is this is a little bit subjective, meaning that no one has set a standard for interoperability. So this is someone, I think it's Rob Dodson, but someone putting a set of tests together that say, here's what we think are acceptable behaviors for interoperability, and then working with the different framework vendors to make sure that, hey, there's an issue, do you think we can solve it? But this is a good place for you to kind of check to see if it's ready to go. So at this point, if you go back to the definition, we have a set of platform APIs, check. They do custom, reusable, and encapsulated tags, check. Work across modern browsers, there's a trackable page for that. We're almost there, not quite, but if you're doing rapid prototyping, go for it. And used with any JS framework, again, not quite there, but there's a page where you can track that. And so this is where we are web components in a nutshell. And at this point, if there's even one person who's on the slot side, I would be super happy. Any slots in the house? Yes, I can go home now. OK, cool. You made my day. Thank you. So the rest of you are still Angry Birds, which works. So switching gears, we're not quite there yet. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time now talking about my experiences, kind of, or like just walking through how we can start playing with these ideas with real code. And I want to talk about what's a good place to start? If you looked at all the code that was written for, if you looked at all the APIs and the way you use it, the problem with that is, like right now, handcrafting all those elements, manually building them up, doing all the testing, it's really painful, right? And this is where web component libraries can help. And a web component library is something that can come in and help you speed up the process of either creating the elements or actually doing the whole workflow for going from creation, composition to deployment. And there's a ton of them in the space. I personally have not used any of them except Polymer. So again, I'm very biased, but I'm telling you so. This is the new 2017 mantra. Like, as long as I tell you, it must be true. That'll be my last political joke, I swear to God. OK, so the reason I say is why use a web component library? There are a bunch of them. So there's Skate, there's, I think there's Slim.js, then Stencil. Polymer is the one that comes from the Google team. And as a Google developer group person, I kind of played with that first because I wanted to tell people about it and use it. But at a very high level, at an abstract level, this is what a component library does for you. One, it provides syntactic sugar. So all the complexity of like JavaScript level APIs can sometimes be abstracted away through declarative, syntax, if you will. And also by the virtue of the fact that you're going to have a bunch of additional boilerplate examples that you can build off of. So in Polymer, for instance, there are scaffolded, like there's a tool you can use to actually scaffold out your initial app that kind of sets up all your configuration hierarchy and everything for you. Second, workflow management. Many of these tools will give you a way for you to actually not just compose this, but actually test it out, build it, work with any of your packaging and deployment solutions to actually get this into a place where you can test it out and show a prototype to someone. In Polymer, and that's the one I'm most familiar with, the things you have are there's a command line interface that lets you scaffold out a new app, test it, serve it out. And there's actually, with Polymer 3, a couple of new options coming in, one including a purple server that allow you to actually look for a very lightweight version that can be PWA compliant. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So for the rest of this talk, I'm actually going to focus on Polymer. So at this point, web components is a standard. Those are the different APIs, and those are the features. How do I actually go about building them with Polymer? So the interesting thing is, at I/O this year in May, Polymer 3.0 was released. And there is a kind of like a radical shift, that a couple of main things that changed between Polymer 2 and Polymer 3, which impact the way we think about web components as well. The first thing is that now, instead of HTML imports, we're using ES6 modules. So you can actually just use standard syntax to import your elements into your code. The second thing is that instead of Bower was the previous tool that was used for dependency management. Now they've moved to NPM. So all those custom elements that you see are now available as NPM installs as well. So what do you have in Polymer? So the Polymer project from Google, and that's the site you can go to look at it, is really three things. It's a web components library that lets you simplify it brings a lot of syntactic sugar for going through the process of creating all those components. Gives you CLI for building efficiently. But it also provides you something called the app toolbox. So as someone who rapidly prototypes apps for people, the app toolbox is a way for you to kind of scaffold out an example app really quickly, and with built-in support for a bunch of different things that most common web apps have. So routing, there's an element for that. I guess I should say that more. Layouts, there's actually a nice app element that gives you various layouts that you can then compose other applications, other elements into. Localization, and most importantly, there are two comprehensive demo apps that are like production-worthy ones. One for news, which is targeting publications, and the other for shop, which is if you're interested in e-commerce. So if you're playing with a space, you can go and actually scaffold out one of these, and then kind of look to see how they've structured the app, and then use that to figure out how you can do your own. But the most important thing about the Polymer team right now is that they're using like when they kind of talk about use the platform, the intent here is that with every passing release, the Polymer layer gets thinner. So you should get to the point where you're really talking directly to the metal, right? So the Polymer as a polyfill should go away, and all you'll be left with is Polymer as a support system to kind of give you all the workflow management and additional components. So how do we go about building elements in Polymer? So at the very high level, there are two parts to it. First, build an element, and the other is how do you build an application. So building an element. If you actually go to that site, you can, well, we won't do it now. But if you go to that site, you can actually walk through a simple demo. But there are two parts to building a simple element. First, you want to create the element, and then you want to manage its state. So to create an element, I don't know if you can see that code, but the first step of creating an element is to extend the class. So Polymer actually sticks with the syntax that was there with the web components model. So it doesn't change much. You basically extend a Polymer element now rather than HTML element. And the reason is the Polymer element class that you use has some additional benefits that it provides. And in addition to this, they also have a library called lit HTML that allows you to do templating, JavaScript templating. And with Polymer element, you now, by extending that, you can use some of the capabilities of that as well. Once you've actually defined a custom element, you register it by doing custom element.define and registering just as before. So the next step is you want to add the shadow DOM. So at this stage, you've got yourself a DOM element that extends the Polymer element, and you want to be able to add your own custom kind of structure to it, like whatever tags or whatever state that you want to add. In here, there's a method called static get template. And you see that in there, you've got the HTML function that returns your string literal, right? So you can use that to actually define the HTML for your component. And I'm not doing a good job of explaining this. But with static get template, what that returns is actually the structure of your shadow DOM that will then be used for you to kind of like provide encapsulation on the back end. Okay, so the next thing about this is composition. If you've got elements that are defined and you only have the ability for the state of the element to be defined internally, how do you actually get components that are children of that element? So let's say I use the NFL team element that we were talking about, and I have that embedded in the main DOM, and it has children. How do I actually allow those children to be styled or allow themselves to be styled based on state or behaviors that I propose, right? And for composing with that, there is this feature called a slot. So with slots, you actually can provide named places within your structure, within your shadow DOM, where you can insert content that comes to you from outside. So the main DOM can actually give you both elements and also styles that you can use to influence this. So I think I have 10 minutes. So I'm going to actually go through this pretty fast. It's data binding. Once you've got your elements, how do you actually get data and bind it to instantiate those templates? With Polymer, we have both one-way data binding and two-way data binding. With one-way data binding, you have the ability to actually just kind of like bind data coming in. You can use, there's a square braces syntax or curly braces syntax if you want two-way data binding that allows you to have both input and output bound to the data in your elements. And finally, there's also this kind of, with your custom element, you can define properties, and you want to be able to have those properties reflect or be synchronized with attribute values when they're used in your main pages themselves. So the way you can do that is you can actually have your two-way data binding between properties that are defined within your elements and the attributes that are used in the HTML. And you can also choose to have these be reflected on each other so that if there are changes to one, they're seen on the other immediately. Template repeating allows you to kind of have a simple syntax, almost like ngRepeat in Angular, where you can create a template once and have that be populated by an array of data, which automatically stamps out instances of it for every data item in the array. And finally, once you've got that element built, how do you actually build an application? So with Polymer, at least for me, starting out, the simple thing was to kind of work with their scaffold. So start with one of their starter templates and see where I can go from there. The Polymer CLI, once you install it, has a very simple set of templates that you can go with. You can start with a Polymer element template, or you can start with an application, which basically just has the element embedded in kind of a simple index HTML file. Or you can have a starter kit that has routes and that has navigation built in and shows you how to actually add more elements to it. But more importantly, you can scaffold out that entire kind of complete built app, like the shop app in this case, and use that to figure out how to do more complex applications. So this is what the Polymer 3 starter kit looks like. You've got routes, you've got elements, and you can go in here and basically, it's a very standard app layout, so you can go in here and start working on this to put your own elements in. Build and deploy. Once you've actually got your elements and apps, the main thing that you go to from here is what else can Polymer do for you? In Chrome Dev Summit, they actually talked about what's the end-to-end apps game with Polymer, and there are 4 parts to it. First is how do you structure your app for performance, right? So you've got your custom elements built, or you've got your front end built out, but what does performance mean? In the case of, and we'll see that in a second. Second is factoring the user interface. How do you actually go about building UIs really quickly with not just yours, but reusing other elements? Third is how do you manage state, and how do you serve for production? For structuring the app for performance, there is a famous pattern called the purple pattern that you've probably heard a million times over. But purple pattern really is looking at an app, a single page app with routes, and optimizing it so that the purple stands for push only code that's needed for the initial route, render and make the initial route stable, then pre-cache code for the other routes and lazy load them as you need them so they're performant. The second part of it is app components. When you're thinking about factoring the user interfaces, your elements don't have to be just individual components, but they can actually be complete app layouts, can be complete complex apps. So you can go to the repository and look for completed app components you can use. Third, I'm going to take just a minute to talk about this. Up until last year, the way they managed state and Polymer was through this mediator pattern. And what that meant is that every element had its own local mediator through which all data coming in was propagated down into the elements, notifications go up and sent out. So all management was local, which meant it was really difficult for you when you had a complex application to manage state traversal throughout. With 2017 and 2018, they've actually moved almost wholesale to like supporting Redux. So if you're familiar with that pattern, there is a Polymer Redux element that you can look at. And we'll talk about this in just 1 second. They're releasing a starter kit right now that is not yet in v1.0, but that has Redux patterns built in as a standard. And finally, serving for production, you can build out a Polymer app as a static site that you can host on Firebase, or you can deploy to App Engine. But they already also have a third option now called the Purple server. And the goal of the Purple server is that you have a stripped down version, a very lightweight server that you can run that can dynamically serve out components to you and actually support the Purple pattern in a more performant way. So 2018 at Google I/O, the big announcement for the Polymer team was that they released this PWA Starter Kit. And this is not yet in 1.0, but it's fast going there. If you are starting a new app now and you want to explore Polymer further, this is the one I would go look at. It has Purple pattern support built in, Redux for state management, and you can use it with that lightweight Purple server to actually have dynamic loading. And finally, this is my kind of last slide. At a very high level, this is my 1 slide recap for it. If you think about it from the perspective of a modern web app, we want to tailor it for user experience, and you also want to tailor it for developer experience. For user experiences, we've got progressive web apps, tools, and technologies that we can use. For developer experiences, this is where you want to look at web components and Polymer if you're thinking of like exploring it from the beginning. For web components, what are they? There are 4 APIs. There's a custom element, a shadow DOM, HTML imports, and HTML templates. For the Polymer project, that's how you would go about using this in a concrete way. It provides syntactic sugar, a polyfills library, performance and best practices, and an app toolbox that gives you a bunch of templates that you can get started with really quickly. Last but not least, this is a shameless plug, but I run the Google Developer Group in New York City. We run workshops. One was called Progressive Web Apps Camp. I'm actually a fan of Progressive Web Apps. It's a full day of learning. We did that last year, and these were all the speakers. We do want to come back and revisit it this year. If you're interested in PWA or want to dive into web components, we're probably going to do this in the last quarter of this year. So come check us out. It's a way for you to kind of know what's the latest and greatest there. And finally, if you're interested in this, all the things I talked about, that's the link to my slides. All the resources for this are in here. Most importantly, the last few are useful because there is a channel where the Polymer team is available if you want to ask them questions. There's also a ton of code labs that you can use to jumpstart yourself learning from elements to like complete apps, and also little features like how you deploy with Firebase. And finally, every year there's a Polymer Summit, and a lot of the things that we talk about are covered in detail by the Polymer team, so you can check that out. And I think that's about it. Thank you. All right, I think, do I have time for Q&A? I have 5 minutes for Q&A. Be nice. Go ahead. Yeah.
So you and other speakers who talked about web components mentioned that there's headaches and complexities and pitfalls. Can you talk about what some of those are?
So I think the most important thing is like if you're doing, the question was, what are some of the most important pitfalls if you're going to try web components adoption? I think the number one thing, at least for me, when I go and talk to clients, say, do you want to build this? The number one thing is it's not yet standard on all browsers. So for example, you can't do this in IE without the polyfills, right? So there's always, that's the first one. The second one, and I'll be completely honest with this, building simple components and like in a sandbox is nice. It's fun. You can play with it. You can understand it. When you start trying to bootstrap whole applications, it's a nightmare. And I shouldn't say that because I actually wanted to go try it out. But the nightmare on it, for me at least, has been that you can't, like state management was a big deal. I couldn't really understand. Sometimes you don't see those components rendering the way they should. The fact that like, how do you take styles in and out? There's like CSS selectors and things like that. There's a lot of like a learning curve, at least for me as a starting down this path to figure out how I can make all that happen. But if you're kind of just doing very basic, a single page app with just trying out like how to embed custom elements and figure out how you can just like play with this idea, then it's okay. I haven't actually deployed to production, so I don't know. There's Chris over there. You should talk to them. They work in Comcast. But yeah.
What's a good use case for an app to get started that kind of covers a lot of the different concepts?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. Okay, so there were two apps. That was Oh, sorry. You were asking what's a good app for you to start with building that will kind of cover all the concepts. So World Cup is coming, or World Cup is here. I actually was in the process of trying to do something for the NFL. The reason I was using all these NFLs is, I don't know if you know this, but NFL has a hidden score feed that you can actually pull data from. So I think that those kind of things are really simple, where you have a lot of kind of small bits of data that have unique characteristics that you can put on a page, a single source of data that you can bind against, and you don't have too many routes, right? So that was a simple app that you can do. The other one that I'm working on with a client is actually on the publishing domain. So they have an app that's using a CMS, and we want to try to see if we can take the CMS out of the picture, take the data, put it on Firebase, and then bind just the front end, like repurpose the front end into components that they can use to give to the content editors to kind of give them a little bit more control over it. So those were the only two that I've worked on. Any other questions? All right. Are we done? Thank you.